showing how any appeal to given authority involved an acceptance of privileged foundations whose absolute primacy could not help but be arbitrary. When, however, the Enlightenment offered the autonomy of flawed conduct and fine artistry as a positive alternative to dependence upon an arbitrary foundation, it misconceived self-determination as itself a first principle of epistemological, ethical, and aesthetic construction. Any first principle has an immediate given character that distinguishes it from any alternative. And the first principle serves to ground something other than itself. By contrast, what is self-determined determines none other than itself, and obtains its defining identity only in the process of its autonomous activity. The Enlightenment sought to liberate reason from subservience to dogmatic assertion by beginning philosophy with a critique of reason. That critique supplanted foundational ontology, which grounded philosophical investigation on an account of being, with a foundational epistemology that sought to determine what true knowledge is so as to provide the credentials with which reason could then proceed to know objects legitimately. Since that critique of reason could not rely upon claims upon what is in order to judge the truth of knowledge, the only way it could certify knowing is by treating it as a foundation that determines the knowable character of any possible object. The conditions of knowing, however they be construed, then operate as determiners of something other than themselves, namely, the objects of a knowing that does not address cognition, but matters other than knowing. As a result, the purveyors of the critique of reason could not put their own knowing of knowing under scrutiny, but had to take for granted the authority of their own critical cognition. The same fate awaited the enlightened and practical philosophers, who sought to repudiate appeal to a highest good by advancing liberty as a first principle of ethical construction. Unlike self-determination, a first principle of liberty has a given character, namely the formal capacity of choice that is given by nature antecedent to any act of will. That natural capacity is formal insofar as it is present in willing any aim, and therefore has no content inherent in it. This formality is what makes liberty the form of willing that can supplant appeal to a highest good, since liberty can serve as a validating principle of conduct with no concern for the content of the ends agent's will. Anything that is done with liberty will count as valid, for what matters is not what is willed, but how it is willed. Legitimate conduct in institutions will thereby owe their validity to the antecedently given form of willing that determines them as derivative factors. What results is a truncated domain of conduct in which personal property rights are the focal point of autonomy, and public institutions have the mission of upholding ownership with the consent of the government. Household, social, and political self-determination have no secured and necessary place in the derivative domain of the realization of liberty. Since legitimate institutions are here means to uphold the principle of willing that is distinct from them, there is always a possibility of a discrepancy between what these institutions achieve and what they are mandated to uphold. The enlightened proponents of liberty find themselves in the conundrum of either maintaining that public institutions can do no wrong, since they've been established with the consent of the government, or leaving it to private judgment to determine whether public institutions should be obeyed or overthrown undermining public authority. Moreover, it is far from evident how the rejection of a highest good gives automatic authority to liberty. Do we have no alternative to looking for the validity of conduct in either the end or form of willing? Might there be a type of conduct uniting end and form, namely self-determined action, where agents will their own autonomy as at once the aim and form of their activity? Enlightenment thinkers are oblivious to such a possibility, precisely because they treat freedom as a privileged foundation and make practical philosophy a theory of ethical construction. Completely analogous pitfalls occur when Enlightenment thinkers attempt to derive aesthetic worth from the process of aesthetic judgment. Instead of upholding the freedom of artistic creation, Enlightenment aestheticians leave the beauty of every work of fine art determined by the same antecedent exercise of taste. Just as transcendental epistemology reduces knowable objects to material things subject to laws of efficient causality, so the Enlightenment aesthetic of taste imposes a common external determining process upon every aspect of beauty. As a result, Enlightenment theorists are at a loss to contend with the exemplary individuality of works of fine art, the unique originality of artistic creation, or how the evaluation of objects of beauty revolves around exploring the unity of their configuration and fundamental significance. Once more, the appeal to a determining foundation leaves normativity problematic. In face of the Enlightenment's failure to escape the impasse of foundationalism in advancing the autonomy of theory and practice in artistic creation, another gambit has gained widespread popularity in trying to rescue the Enlightenment ideal. This is a strategy of a holist defense of rational autonomy. It regards all justification to inevitably depend upon some given context of commonly held intuitions or conceptual schemes or frameworks of conversation that alone can provide some non-subjective basis for supporting liberty of thought, of action, and of aesthetic value. The holist strategy maintains that we find ourselves within an historically contingent web of shared belief that can most coherently be understood as subscribing to those ideals of freedom and equality. In this manner, John Rawls offers not the theory of justice, but a theory of justice, issuing from a method of so-called reflective equilibrium. Rawls invites us to reflect upon the supposed consensus of our moral intuitions and come up with a procedure of ethical construction that best conforms to them. The result is a holist social contract argument, which assumes the embrace of equal consideration of all persons, grounded not on nature or reason, but on the historic and contingent prevalence of immediately given moral commitments, of which Rawls claims transparent certainty. Richard Rorty makes a completely analogous holist turn, appealing to the ongoing conversation of mankind, that allegedly can only operate on the basis of contingently given common conceptual frameworks. On this basis, Rorty exiles those thinkers who do not share his ideals, Nietzsche being a prime intellectual misfit, as individuals who simply cannot be engaged with in discussion. Their refusal to accept the prevailing norms of conversation makes them pathological figures, tantamount to lunatics with whom argument is pointless. All these rescue attempts to redeem Enlightenment beliefs founder on the same dilemma. They accept the inability to justify foundations of truth, right, or beauty, such as those to which the Enlightenment appealed, but they accept the inescapability of foundational justification and treat the foundations of rationality as contingently given frameworks that holistically provide a frame of reference for all discourse. In doing so, they incoherently purport to have unqualified knowledge of this predicament and transparent knowledge of what the prevailing framework is, be it construed as our moral intuitions or the shared conceptual scheme of the conversation of mankind. Not only do they undermine their own ability to justify their diagnosis of our pursuit of knowledge, right, and beauty, but they make it impossible for anyone to take seriously the ideals they seek to buttress. On no account can the holist purveyors of Enlightenment ideals refute anyone who opposes them and does not share the arbitrary assumptions that the holists invoke. Nietzsche, Rorty's archetypal outcast from the ongoing conversation of mankind, presents a more self-conscious understanding of the limits of the Enlightenment and our predicament if we are entrapped by the pitfalls of foundational justification. Nietzsche does so by reconstructing all the normative strivings of rational agency as a will to power, whereas the holist apologists for an Enlightenment consensus present their efforts as benign exercises in consistent self-validation. Once one recognizes that they operate on the basis of unjustified assumptions, one can follow Nietzsche and unmask them as perpetrators of a power play. What they're doing is advancing the particular values their group cherishes as universal norms to which everyone should bow down, as if these norms were justifiable, if not by nature or reason, at least by the conditions of discourse. In so doing, the holists are willing their domination over humanity. This is not the unique bane of their activity. If, as both holists and Nietzsche maintain, the appeal to arbitrary foundations underlies all attempts to posit universal norms, then the entire enterprise of rationality turns out to be an exercise of will to power, in which values are shoved down everyone else's throat by those who happen to choose them as their privileged standards. Whereas the holists piously ignore their power play, Nietzsche presents an alternative to their hypocrisy. The Enlightenment and its defenders have hypocritically presented their posited particular values as if they were universally valid, hiding the will to power they actually exercise. Nietzsche presents the one and only alternative to this hypocrisy. He will brazenly assert his chosen values as a will to power, and make no excuses for how they are rooted in his particular will and are advanced as instruments of his domination over all others. This uniquely consistent exercise of the will to power provides the basic and most theoretically powerful recipe for fascism. As George Lukács points out in his Destruction of Reason, the most astute Nazi ideologues did not justify their tyranny by appeal to pseudo-scientific assertions of racial superiority. Instead, they saw themselves as advancing a purely arbitrary will to power, affirming the given contingent particularity of their German identity without need of any further basis. For them, the universality of household, social, and political rights is a bogus hypocrisy, whereas the unabashed quest for world domination of the German people is a consistent assertion of value, which is inevitably particular and perspectival. Nietzsche's deconstruction of rationality as a will to power might seem to subvert itself, since it renders its own diagnosis relative to the particular assertion of value of Nietzsche himself. For Nietzsche, however, this is a false problem, for nothing he is offering is intended to claim a truth or right or beauty that has universal validity. So long as justification is assumed to rest on given foundations, which as such can never be more than arbitrary assertions, the demand for unconditional legitimacy is an idle gesture. All that can be done is to distinguish between the inconsistent hypocrisy of the advocates of universal values and the consistent will to power of unabashed zealots of the particular, of which fascism is the standard bearer, wanting our time. Perhaps the most potent elaboration of the Nietzschean invitation to a fascist politics is Carl Schmitt's deconstruction of political theory. Schmitt's deconstruction of politics revolves around four interrelated theses that not only call into question the parliamentary democracies of our time, but open the door to fascist theory. These are the seductive ideas. One, that political theory is reconceivable as political theology. Two, that the identity of politics rests upon a friend-foe opposition. Three, that sovereignty does not operate through a balance of powers, upholding a constitutional framework to which it belongs, but rather wields an unlimited power that decides whether or not a normal situation prevails in which rule by and under law can function. And four, the dictatorship is an inevitable feature of politics, both as a constituting power that brings into being a constitutional order and as a commissary dictator that suspends the existing constitution so as to ensure its eventual continuance. All of these provisos arise from accepting that the plight of the Enlightenment appeal to foundations defines the limits to which normative political theory is condemned. For that very reason, they all stand or fall upon whether justification can be freed of foundations. The governing theses of Schmitt's deconstruction of politics all converge in two corollary respects. On the one hand, they all involve a formal neutrality, reflecting a purely descriptive approach. On the other hand, they all impute to political theory and praxis a subjection to external determination, undercutting the autonomy of thought and conduct. Schmitt's descriptive orientation is plainly manifest. The reduction of political conception to political theology applies to every politics, no matter what values it upholds. Similarly, the rooting of politics in a friend-foe opposition is allegedly constitutive of every body politic, irrespective of its specific construal of what is right. So too, the identification of the sovereign as the unconstrained constituent power on which all constitutional government depends is completely neutral to what a state should be. Finally, the appeal to dictatorship is presented as something to which every regime is liable. Schmitt's fundamentally descriptive theory of politics goes against the political thinking of every philosopher truly worthy of the name. The great philosophers all recognize that reason can tell us nothing about what any convention is, since institutions are products of arbitrary concatenations of will, leaving their enactment and perpetuation inevitably contingent. What reason alone can do is what no descriptive account can achieve, provide a conception of what conventions should be. From Plato to Aristotle to the social contract theorists of the Enlightenment, and on to Hegel, all major political philosophers have conceived not what the state is, but what the just state is. Schmitt, like Nietzsche, rejects the very possibility of any universally valid normative theory. And like Nietzsche, he roots this rejection in the alleged inability of political thinkers to free their investigation of given foundations. This is not just a problem of theorizing, but endemic to the object of political thought. Politics is fraught with heteronomy and bereft of autonomy because political association is determined by external factors that deprive political institutions of a self-standing independence that could be the object of an equally autonomous and foundation-free political thinking. Schmitt's notion of political theology does this by rendering all political theorizing a secularization of theological thought. What allows political conception to be deconstructed as theology is that political sovereignty itself exhibits the determination of the state by a power that transcends political organization and wields an absolute decision-making on which rests all rule by and under law. Whether construed as Hobbes' mortal god, the Leviathan, whose command cannot be limited, or as the pouvoir constituant of the Revolutionary Assembly, from which constitutional government emerges, political sovereignty is always tantamount to a secularization of divine majesty. Since without valid rational justification, faith rests on a decision to believe, the identification of political theorizing with political theology leaves political theory just as conditioned by an act of will as political practice. A wholly analogous externality applies to the very concept of the political in Schmitt's thesis that political association constitutively rests upon the opposition of states as mortal foes of one another. Allegedly, nothing internal to the body politic possesses any specifically political character. Supposedly, all domestic concerns are consumed with particular interests that never engage the totality of the state. This, on Schmitt's account, is why Enlightenment social contract theory fails to conceive the essence of politics, limiting civil government to upholding private property and commerce. Only when states confront one another as enemies that threaten to destroy their entire security and independence does the encompassing political concern for sovereignty come into play. Needless to say, since the opposition concerns the very existence of the state, no matter what organization it has, the identity such antagonism foists upon politics is completely indifferent to any questions of justice. The resulting concept of the political is not only normatively neutral, but one that deprives the state of any intrinsic character of its own. On these terms, the autonomy of politics is simply precluded. All that the state can be is an instrument of self-serving power with no other essential content. The heteronomy of politics reaches its climax in Schmitt's claim that the implementation of law is extraneous to norms of justice and constitutionality as a whole. This is because the very authority of rule by and under law supposedly depends upon a decision by the sovereign to acknowledge that there exists a sufficiently normal situation for constitutional legality to operate. What counts as a normal condition is unilaterally decided by the sovereign, since all powers of government depend upon this decision to be able to proceed with their functions. The whole fabric of constitutional government is thereby reduced to an arbitrary posit of an unconstrained sovereign power that has no duties and determines something other than itself. Needless to say, if rule under and by law is based by an extraneous decision of an unlimited will, constitutionality can always be suspended, where the sovereign judges the normal situation to be in forfeit and declares a state of emergency. This is why Schmitt seals the heteronomy of politics by rendering constitutional government hostage to dictatorship. The notorious Article 48, Section 2 of the Weimar Constitution allowed for the president to call a state of emergency and assume dictatorial powers. Hitler would invoke such powers and begin dismantling Weimar democracy with the servile cooperation of the parliament and judiciary bending to the whip of Nazi party terror. It is not hard to see how all four heteronomous provisos of Schmitt's deconstruction of politics pave the way today, as they did before, for the destruction of constitutional democracy and its replacement by fascist rule, wielding and all too consistent will to power. Schmidt saw this happen and regarded the outcome as a vindication of his political conception. We, however, see a historical catastrophe whose apologists ignore the theoretical option that also eluded the Enlightenment. Every one of Schmidt's provisos, like Nietzsche's whole notion of will to power, hinges upon the identification of rationality with foundational justification. So long as rationality cannot free itself of juridical foundations, that is, of given assumptions that determine what counts as true, right, and beautiful, the Enlightenment defense of freedom is insupportable, as is the holist appeal to our normative intuitions or the accepted conceptual schemes of the ongoing conversation of humanity. The inescapability of juridical foundations, however, is an unsustainable dogma that subverts itself when the foundation is called into question on its own terms. The foundation that confers justification upon whatever counts as true, right, beautiful, or otherwise normatively valid cannot draw its own identity and privilege role from any other factor than itself, since it uniquely confers justification upon that which is valid. Its own validity must derive from itself. In other words, the foundation of validity must be founded upon itself. If that is so, the whole distinction upon which foundational justification rests is cancelled. Whereas foundational justification distinguishes between what confers validity and what possesses validity, that defining distinction is removed when the foundation is compelled on its own terms to be the source of its own validity. Then what justifies and what is justified are one and the same. The source of normativity cannot achieve self-referential consistency unless it is self-determined. Whereas foundational justification operates with heteronomy, rendering truth, right, and beauty externally determined by a privileged factor different from themselves, the foundation on which it depends cannot sustain its own normativity without reverting to autonomy. The substance of normativity is inescapably foundation-free self-determination, be it the self-determination of reason, the autonomy of conduct, or the independent freedom of artistic creation and the work of fine art. There is no other alternative. For if what is true, right, or beautiful is held to derive its validity from something other than itself, its source of normativity can only sustain its own privileged validity if it grounds itself and reverts to self-determination. This inexorable identification of normativity with self-determination is what eludes the Enlightenment and its holist apologists, as well as Nietzsche, Schmidt, and all the other grave diggers of freedom who deconstruct rationality as will to power. The overcoming of foundationalism through the identification of normativity and self-determination is what secures the refutation of fascism in all its forms. The unraveling of Schmidt's deconstruction of political theory becomes evident once we apply to each of his provisos the consequences of recognizing that ethics is the philosophy of right, where right is the reality of self-determination. Normative conduct does not owe its validity to embodying an antecedently determined highest good, or by being derived from a privileged procedure of construction. Instead, right is a foundation-free totality of freedom, consistent in a self-sustaining system of all the rights that individuals can exercise. The will is not self-determined by exercising the liberty of a choosing will, whose form is given by nature and whose chosen alternatives are externally given. Instead, agents achieve self-determination by interacting in terms of rights, where each wields a prerogative that can only be exercised by enabling others to do the same. Each right involves a reciprocity of entitlement and obligation, where one's willing is lawful and objective. Lawful by exercising the prerogative that is not a privilege but a universal entitlement, and objective by being dutifully recognized in the compatible choices of one's counterparts. Such interaction generates a conventional form of agency, shared by all participants, in which the chosen alternatives they opt for are only available within the context of their interaction. Only on this basis can agents determine both the form and content of their agency. The most elementary right consists in the interaction of property owners, wherein persons determine themselves as having a recognized external domain for their individual wills that does not conflict with that of anyone else. All further rights depend upon this minimal self-determination, because if one has not won recognition as the exclusive owner of one's own body, nothing one does can count as an exercise of one's own will. Given that there are a plurality of rights, there must be a form of self-determination that upholds all these modes of self-determination in conformity with one another, as well as with this overarching form of freedom. Otherwise, the realm of freedom depends upon some external factor for its own existence, undermining the autonomy of its activity. This is the minimal recipe for political freedom, as the interaction in which individuals determine themselves as self-governing citizens, ruling over the whole domain of conduct. There can be no conflict between political self-determination and upholding pre-political rights, for the simple reason that any deficit in pre-political freedom involves obstructions to autonomy that prevent individuals from engaging in self-government on an equal footing. If, for example, family members are subject to hierarchies based on gender and sexual orientation, or if members of civil society are subject to blockages of economic opportunity, these inequities will hinder the equal political participation of individuals. For this reason, self-government is necessarily constitutional, bound by an internal standard to uphold the pre-political rights on which equal political opportunity depends, as well as the political organization necessary for the exercise of self-rule. The key to constitutional freedom resides in the balance of power in which no agent within the state can act in the name of the whole without being co-determined directly or indirectly by the will of every citizen. The legislative power by which government rules by law can be guaranteed to rule under constitutional law only if the legislation it approves cannot count as law until it is authorized to be constitutional by a separate power restricted to certifying the constitutionality of bills, and if the executive action is authorized to carry out valid legislation. In this way, self-government can be a self-sustaining totality of freedom in which both political and pre-political rights are upheld. Schmitt's deconstruction of political theory as political theology is doubly refuted by the foundation-free normativity of constitutional self-government. On the one hand, with the identification of normativity and self-determination, political philosophy can fulfill its unique task of conceiving what the state should be without appeal to any belief in a source of validity that transcends the internal workings of self-government. All political thought must do to conceive normative politics is to think through the internal constitution of the self-governing state as it presides over all the other pre-political interactions of life. There is simply no need to invoke some absolute foundation of political authority. On the other hand, once the just state is recognized to be a constitutional self-government that embodies the totality of self-determination, the sovereign can no longer be hypostasized as an unbound will existing prior to the body politic, as some constituent demiurge, nor as a figure within the state who wields a quasi-divine might to suspend or re-inaugurate constitutional rule whenever it sees fit. The state instead acts as a sovereign body through the co-determination of its citizenry, as realized in the balance of powers of legislative, authorizing, and executive branches that together sustain self-government while maintaining the property, moral, household, and social rights of its members in conformity with their equal political opportunities. Only through this imminent, co-determined activity, where no particular will outside or inside the state unilaterally orders the body politic, can self-government exhibit the four cardinal features of political freedom. 1, the reflexivity of self-rule. 2, the universality of political ends. 3, the supremacy of politics over all other conventions. And 4, the autonomy of political action. If instead an independent sovereign lords over the state, ruler and ruled cannot be one. Political ends are hostage to the particular aims of that master. Politics becomes subordinate to that unmediated power, and political activity is externally determined. All the preceding considerations that liberate politics from the clutches of political theology equally refute the pillar of Schmitt's identification of politics, the opposition to humanity. Instead of defining the state by how citizens engage in rule and thereby preside over the pre-political spheres of household and society, Schmitt regards governing as an empty exercise of power whose only distinguishing feature is its self-assertion against the one and only power that challenges its entire existence and any state. Schmitt's appeal to an external opposition to another state is viciously circular. The opposition presupposes the existence of a plurality of states. Moreover, it is wholly contingent whether the mere plurality of politically organized communities sets them in moral enmity. States may exist in relative isolation, leaving them unaffected by the existence of others. Moreover, since states can greatly differ in economic and military power, it is hardly necessary that even contiguous states find themselves in mutual jeopardy. What seals the refutation of any derivation of politics from external determination is the distinctive character of political freedom, which no other exercise of rights shares. By partaking in self-rule, citizens exercise the distinctly reflexive activity of self-government, where ruler and ruled are one. In so doing, citizens act politically by willing ends that are universal insofar as they order the totality of their community. This universal scope is something the exercise of rights never possesses when it involves disposing over property, acting in accord with subjective conscience, co-determining a particular private domain of family, engaging in the pursuit of self-selected needs for the commodities of others, or joining in social interest groups to promote a shared particular aim. Moreover, only by participating in politics do citizens wield action that is supreme, governing all other spheres of their community. Thereby, citizens engage in activity that is fully autonomous, subordinate to no other institution. Together, these four cardinal features of just political action, reflexivity, universality, supremacy, and autonomy, provide a distinguishing identity of normative political association. They are all achievable in the fully self-contained political process. That is what it determines itself to. By contrast, the brazen will to power of fascist politics is constitutively a drive for world mastery over others, by a regime distinguishing itself from them through the given identity and privileges. The fascist regime's consistent will to power is therefore necessarily directed at other states, whose very independence makes them its irrevocable enemies. Consequently, the refutation of Schmidt's appeal to the opposition to a foe undermines the core of fascist politics. The self-determined character of normative politics no less excludes Schmidt's basic claim that rule by and under law rests upon the decision of a sovereign power to declare a normal situation in which constitutional government can hold sway. Although Schmidt distanced himself from the legal positivism of Kelsen, both Schmidt and Kelsen fundamentally accept the foundationalist framework for legal authority, whereby rule by and under law rests upon an otherwise arbitrary decision to accept some constitutional order. What both ignore is how such authority can hardly have any non-arbitrary standing for those who submit to it. It becomes reduced to an historical accident that can just as well be supplanted by any other positive system. No such problem afflicts the authority of a constitutional democracy upholding the pre-political rights that make equal political opportunity possible. The Constitution that mandates sustaining political freedom and its normative prerequisites is internal to the self-governing state. Not only is the Constitution a standard falling within the body politic, but its reality as more than a paper writ lies in nothing other than the predominant exercise of rights by citizens and non-citizen residents in accord with its provisions. No decision by any power outside constitutional self-government brings the Constitution into force or can revoke its authority. The absence of any such foundational authority has its positive embodiment in how constitutionality is upheld through a balance of power that prevents any particular will within the state to be able to act in its name without the co-determination of all citizens. We now arrive at the last nail in the coffin of political fascism, the refutation of any permissible invocation of a state of exception and dictatorship. Nothing proclaims the hegemony of politics more directly than Schmidt's claim that sovereign power is always at liberty to declare a state of exception and introduce dictatorial rule. This, of course, is the other side of Schmidt's dogma, that rule by and under law is contingent upon a decision by the sovereign power to acknowledge a normal situation. Once foundational justification has been overcome by the identification of normativity with self-determination, legitimate sovereign power cannot operate apart from the workings of constitutional self-government. If that framework were itself suspended, sovereignty would cease to exist, and politics would revert to illegitimate usurpation and anarchy. Dictatorship is in principle prohibited, since it neither sustains the actuality of political self-determination, nor can belong to the internal operations of constitutional self-government. Fascism is not only antithetical to legitimate politics, but based on an insupportable rejection the possibility of overcoming the foundational condition of conflict. Schmidt's deconstruction of politics ends up falling prey to the same dogmatism that undercuts Nietzsche's deconstruction of rationality as will to power. We need not be powerless to refute political fascism and exile its advocates from rational discourse. Autonomous reason can take them on, and it is our responsibility to do so, as long as fascism remains unpunished. Thank you.